Hi, my name is Robert Dewar, and I will be doing my presentation on the impact of corporal punishment, and specifically the impact spanking has on children. First off, I want to define what corporal punishment is and give some examples of it. I'm going to be using definitions and information retrieved from the article Corporal Punishment, a scientific review of its use in discipline. I'm going to be using this article on this slide and the two after. So, corporal punishment is just a general term for physical punishment. Some examples of it include, but are not limited to, ordinary spanking, beating, kicking, punching, choking, face slapping, scalding, and starvation. Now, a lot of those examples sound like straight up child abuse. So what's the difference? Child abuse is defined as non-accidental injury inflicted by a parent or caregiver. In comparison, disciplinary spanking is defined as physically non-injurious, intended to modify behavior, and administered with an open hand to the extremities or buttocks. Going off of those definitions, disciplinary spanking matches the criteria for child abuse. While both fall under the general classification of corporal punishment, the intents are very different. I got this chart from the same article as I got the previous definitions, and I love it because it's a direct comparison between spanking and child abuse, and it tells you the act, the intent, the attitude, and the result of each. So for the act, disciplinary spanking is one or two swats to the buttocks of a child, and physical child abuse is physical assault, including to beat, kick, punch, choke, etc. The intent is one of the most important differences between the two. The intent of disciplinary spanking is training and to modify behavior, while physical child abuse is violence, physical force intended to injure or abuse. The parents' attitude behind the acts are different as well. The attitude behind disciplinary spanking is love and concern, while the attitude behind physical child abuse is anger and malice. The graph labels the final row of the chart the result. I'd like to change it to the intended result since there's controversy over the spanking. However, the intended results for disciplinary spanking are mild to moderate discomfort for behavioral correction, while the intended result for physical child abuse is physical and emotional injury. As I said near the end of the last slide, there's a lot of controversy about whether spanking and corporal punishment should be classified as child abuse or not. In a lot of Europe, any type of corporal punishment is deemed illegal and banned. That means that not even the parents themselves are allowed to spank their children. A lot of the rest of the countries deemed first world have it only legal for their parents to spank their kids. However, the United States has no federal law saying that spanking or corporal punishment is banned at any level, even for schools or government. The state level is where we see some legislation banning corporal punishment in the education system. Only 19 states, mostly in the South, still have corporal punishment legal from kindergarten through 12th grade. Now on to some general statistics. Approximately 90% of parents have reported using physical discipline across childhood, according to most studies, and the most common type of physical discipline is spanking. The most popular age is around school age, so about 6 to 12. But even then, 11% of children are spanked from 6 to 11 months old, and about 15% of 12-month-olds have been spanked. Boys are more likely to be spanked than girls are, but mothers are typically the ones to spank their children more than fathers are. Alright, so what are some predictors of spankings, or who is more likely to be spanked? Irritable temperaments in children are more likely to get them spanked. Young, inexperienced mothers are more likely to spank their children than experienced mothers. This is because they usually learn better forms of discipline throughout their years and experience. Depressed, anxious, and stressed parents are more likely to spank their children. Parents who were spanked as children are more likely to spank their children. And households with more children or with a single parent are more likely to have spanking. This is because it's just easier to spank your child than to discipline them in almost any other way. The fourth bullet down is in bold because I think it's very important and because I'm going to be talking about it a little later in the next slide. I'm going to refer to this as generational spanking. So, generational spanking leads my conversation into spanking across cultures. As I said in the previous slide, parents who were spanked as children are more likely to spank their own children, meaning it's something that's passed down generationally. We can see a lot of overlap on the last two slides regarding cultural predictors of spanking and non-cultural predictors of spanking. Firstly, spanking is very popular in the South, as we saw on the map of where corporal punishment is legal. Next, we could look at spanking among African American families and in families who have a low socioeconomic status. In many studies, the participants were overlapping in both of these categories. Because of that, it was hard to determine which is a bigger impactor between the two. White and Hispanic families are less likely to spank their children than African American families, each of the former being relatively equal in terms of likelihood to spank their children. It's important to note that the Hispanic population is very diverse themselves and is made up of many cultures and countries, so there may be some differences among the smaller populations within the larger Hispanic population. Now we get to talk about the impacts that spanking has. First off, I would like to note that the first bullet point here is from a different study than the rest of the bullets. In the first study, they presented children an image of a mean face and observed the brain to see their responses. In this study, 40 children had been spanked and 107 had not, while the mean age of all children was a little bit over 11 and a half years old. The scientists observed activation in multiple regions of the medial and lateral prefrontal cortex for children who had been spanked. The prefrontal cortex is many things, but the most important function it has is to help control emotion and cognitive function. The activation of it shows that spanking impacts children's emotion and cognitive function. The rest of the bullets come from a second study, which had school-aged boys watch a 1-minute video of a boy being yelled at, shaken, and spanked. This study also had a second group of boys serving as a control group watch a different 1-minute video in which the caregiver was being gentler and non-violent. Afterward, it was apparent that those who had watched the violent video were more aggressive with their toys during playtime. This is because the boys' level of cortisol rose, which is our primary stress hormone. The same thing happens to children who are spanked. This isn't the only impact on the brain though. Spanking may also reduce the volume of a brain's gray matter in areas associated with performance, which is why those spanked usually have slower cognitive development. Those spanked as a kid may suffer from mental health issues all of their lives. Some examples of these issues include depression, unhappiness, anxiety, a feeling of hopelessness, drug and alcohol abuse, and more general psychological maladjustments. It's important to note that these impacts stand true across every culture, which is a common misconception about spanking. Thinking back to one of the first slides, I said that around 90% of parents reported spanking their children. If this is true, you might be wondering how more of the population isn't all messed up after reading all of the negative things that spanking can do to kids. Well, of course, there are many other determinants to good parenting, one of which being communication. From my research, I did find many studies that suggested good communication and lighter, less frequent spankings will have less of a negative impact. However, I think it is important to note that it was very hard for me to find any study that suggested spanking had an overall positive influence. Here is a chart from the last slide, bigger so hopefully you can see it better. This took a little while for me to understand, but the higher you go on the y-axis is worse depressive symptoms, and the farther you go on the right, the farther right you go on the x-axis is how extreme corporal punishment is in a child's life. Basically, what the graph is showing is that corporal punishment will not ruin a child's life as long as it's not extreme and if there are still some positive communications. That's not an endorsement of corporal punishment, but it does make sense that this is the case, especially if we were to believe that 90% of children have been spanked. Lastly, I want to compare corporal punishment with a very broad category I'm calling gentle parenting. We've seen that corporal punishment can hurt a child's development, but it can also increase aggression, fear, and lead to insecure attachment between a child and their caregiver. On the other hand, gentle parenting can help a child's development. It can improve a child's current and future relationships with peers and their caregiver, and it can lead to a secure attachment between the child and their caregiver. In addition to these, corporal punishment can hurt a child's communication skills because of bad modeling. Gentle parenting can teach a child how to communicate their frustrations and show them that their caregiver respects them and views them as an equal. Modeling is defined as a general process in which persons serve as models for others, exhibiting the behavior to be imitated by the others. In simpler terms, modeling is when a child learns what to do and what not to do by imitating a role model, most likely a parent or caregiver. So when related to corporal punishment, I think it becomes evident as to why spanking and hitting can lead to bad modeling for children. That concludes everything. Here's my sources. I didn't really know how to give in-text citations for PowerPoint, but my citations are at the bottom of each slide. Thank you very much.